So Notre Dame, Virginia, that game in South Bend.
Yes, sir. Senior day for Notre
Okay.
Dame. Yep, last home game of the year.
All right, Tony Elliott and the crew had lost 3 consecutive games. They went to Pitt on Saturday night. They were aided by a 5th down call. That was an interesting one, not necessarily of the infamy of Missouri and Colorado back in 1990, but there was a situation in which, as I understand it, I did not see the play, that Virginia was stopped by Pitt's defense on a 4th down play, but the officials were not set in their positions to properly call the play, and therefore they allowed Virginia to run the play again. Is that not what happened?
I don't believe you, Mark. I don't believe that the ACC officials would screw up something that bad. I have never seen anything like an ACC official costing a team a game or impacting the outcome of a game like that. I don't know if I can believe that, Mark. At least in a game that didn't include Miami. It's just gotten so bad, Mark. It really has. Oh, goodness gracious. You're like, did I mess it up again? Pitt was just, honestly, Pitt was not the better team that game anyway. It's unfortunate it turned out the way that it did, but Pitt wasn't the better team that day. And what you see from Virginia, Mark, is this is a team that doesn't have great talent outside of a couple guys. I mean, Jonas Sanker's a dude at safety. I mean, he's an outstanding player. And, normally Xavier Watts is without question the best safety on the field, and he's the best safety on the field on Saturday, but this is one of the few times he's on the field and you're like, yeah, that other guy's pretty good too, with the way he plays. They're very different players, but he's a heck of a player. But for the most part, what it is, Mark, it's a very veteran team that's big and physical, and they're coached relatively well from a they don't beat themselves standpoint, and they play hard and they play with sound technique, and they seem to really to respond well to Tony Elliott. A lot of players might have quit on him the way that last season went for a while, but those players play hard for him, and they just lack top level talent, to be honest with you, at this point in time. But teams like that can be dangerous. They have a couple dynamic guys on offense, at receiver Malachi Fields, and then at running back Xavier Brown, who's been a little banged up, but he's healthy. And you have a quarterback that can make some plays with his legs. He's like a gamer type. He's like their Ian Book, type of guy, just a gamer. And that can make them dangerous if you're not locked in. But at the end of the day, there's still a pretty big talent gap, and Notre Dame needs to be able to take advantage of it on Senior Day.
Yeah, I somewhat fell in love with Anthony Calandria last year as just a freshman. There was a quarterback battle between he and Tony Muskett, and they went back and forth, and Calandria should have pulled out a game against Louisville on a Thursday or Friday night, went back and forth, and just a number of times, if you looked at Virginia, because of that talent gap that they face against a lot of teams, and certainly Notre Dame, that they got annihilated maybe twice last year in a 3-9 season, but they played a ton of games, very tough, down to the wire, hung in games, beat North Carolina. They had no business doing that. And again, hung in a few other games. Louisville comes to mind. And they're pretty similar this year, although they've found ways to win to get themselves to 5-4. So on the Notre Dame side, all these Army matchup rankings that I jotted down, they're all out the window. My goodness. I had some good stuff here. I was going to make the Army-Navy comparison. I was going to do a lot of that business.
And you look at Virginia too, Mark, and their 5-4 record. I mean, they've played good teams. I mean, they've battled good teams. I mean, they've got a loss to Louisville, and they've battled Louisville twice. Like there to Jeff Brom in Louisville, what Dino Babers in Syracuse were to Dabo during his runs. Where they beat him once, almost beat him a couple other times, and took him down to the wire. Lost at Clemson by 17. Lost to an okay Maryland team that can sometimes look good. Lost to North Carolina. Right now, North Carolina is playing its best football of the season. Took Georgia Tech down to the – I mean, that's a really good Georgia Tech team, as we found out. And Georgia Tech needed a walk-off long touchdown run from Jamal Haynes to win that game. And then they went out and smacked Virginia, smacked North Carolina. They're on a bye week. So they've played a challenging schedule, and like you said, though, they're a competitive football team. Their last couple games weren't all that close. They're a little banged up, but they're getting healthier. And I think that Pitt game was huge for them. They had a bye between North Carolina and Pitt. I think that allowed them to kind of recover and regroup and get themselves back on track. And the other thing, too, that's weird about them is they're much better away from home than they are at home. They're 3-1 this season away from home. They beat Wake Forest, Coastal Carolina, and Pitt, and their only loss was to Clemson.
52-3 against Florida State. Now, we know what Florida State football looks like this season. It's the biggest free fall we've seen in modern college football history. Is there anything that can be gleaned from that performance on the Notre Dame side?
Well, my talking points coming out of that game, Mark, is you're starting to see Notre Dame turn a corner as a program, right? Like not turning the corner to the point where like, championship, here we come, right? There's a lot of hurdles they need to clear before you get there. But what you're starting to see is that Notre Dame is doing to teams like Florida State and Georgia Tech and Navy and just Stanford and go down the line, what an elite team is supposed to do to them, which is just dominate them. Here's a crazy stat for you, Mark. This is the 7th straight game that Notre Dame has won. And in all 7 games, Notre Dame has handed that team their worst defeat of the season. Like I read something very lazy on ESPN from Mark Schlabach, and I was disappointed because I don't usually see this type of lazy analysis from someone like Mark Schlabach. But he said, he was kind of poo-pooing why he dropped Notre Dame out of the college football playoff after they beat Florida State 52-3. And it was, no, they did to Florida State what everybody else has done. And I'm like, nah, that's lazy because they didn't. Because if you take Florida State's next 2 biggest margins of defeat this year, they lost to SMU, a top 15 team, by 26, and they lost to Miami, a top 15 team, by 22. I'm not a great math major, but my guy added it up on the show today. 26 plus 22 equals 48. Well, Notre Dame beat them by 49. So it takes their 2 worst losses to equal what Notre Dame did to them. And when you've done that for 7 straight games, I mean, I was making a point on Twitter the other day, and Ohio State fans just failed to understand it. It's like anything you say, anytime you bring up Ohio State, they think you're attacking them. And I pointed out that if you look at what Notre Dame did to Purdue compared to what Oregon and Ohio State did to Purdue, and you look at those 2 teams combined to score 80 points against Purdue. Well, Notre Dame scored 66. I'm actually going to find this tweet because it was actually it's like kind of looking at it. Let me get here it is. Oregon and Ohio State combined to outgain Purdue by 347 yards. So total difference in yards, add those 2 together. Notre Dame outgained Purdue by 416 yards. Ohio State and Oregon combined to rush for 304 yards against Purdue. Notre Dame rushed for 362. So, of course, Ohio State fans took that as, you lost in Northern Illinois. I'm like, don't be dumb. Who are the number 1 and 2 teams in the country? Oregon and Ohio State. Who have I advocated should be ranked number 1 and 2 on my show? Oregon and Ohio State. I'm making the point that if you take what right now would be the gold standard of college football, those 2 teams, and you look at how Notre Dame performed against them, and you look at how Notre Dame performed against Florida State compared to like a Miami, for example, or a Clemson, for example, if you look at how Notre Dame has performed against different teams they've played, you look at and say, boy, they're really dominant. And they're dominant even beyond what other really good teams are able to dominate those teams. So it's drawing a comparison. It's not meant to say if Notre Dame played Ohio State tomorrow, they'd win by, X number of yards. You're missing the point. The point is when you watch this Notre Dame team week after week after week, they're playing absolutely dominant football. But here's the scary thing, Mark. I didn't think Notre Dame played great football against Florida State. They played good. They didn't play great. They had some real sloppy misses. Riley Leonard had a couple misses of throws that he should have made. You had 2 big drops in the game. You had some missed tackles. The run defense was okay, but not great. And it was a kind of a sloppy game because you're coming out of your bye week. You've had some time off, and it just took them a while to kind of get going. And they still won by 49 against a Power 4 team. It's a sucky Power 4 team. But you've handed 2 teams this season the worst regular season loss in their program's history. This tied the one for Florida State, and Purdue's the worst loss they've had in school history. When you've done that in a 7-game winning streak, you're pretty freaking good. And that's the point. And the Florida State game was just the latest example of that. Now, for the key for Notre Dame is, okay, can you keep it going?